Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 29 of Series 10. The question for today is, how can we explain ontological relations between mind and brain, if any? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 6, Section 6. In these workshops, I have proposed that the phenomenon of consciousness is the basis for a philosophy of life. That is, a philosophy of life based on an aspect of mind or consciousness that we call value. And that value provides a principle of the will to value leading to a certain sufficiency of value. But I explain and argue for the importance of value in other workshops and writings. In recent workshops, we have considered numerous features as possible preconditions of mind or consciousness, such as the brain, its constituents and its organization, life, complexity, physicalism, panpsychism, information, language, temporality, and other people. We have also considered 1. Interaction, 2. The external world, 3. Graduation, 4. Contingency, and 5. Complexity. In this study, I will be looking more closely at these last 5 features. That's because they will figure strongly here in the relation between mind and brain. We should also briefly say something about the status and difficulty of this mind-brain relation. David Chalmers described the explanation of subjective experience from the brain as the hard problem. Paul Davies called this arguably the hardest problem facing science today. And Joseph Levine famously speaks of an explanatory gap about the origins of mind. Another clarification that I should make is the basic distinction between mind and consciousness. They are often used interchangeably, and until recently this distinction was hardly made. Broadly speaking, mind can include every aspect of mental life, like the unconscious, animal minds, and genetics. Yet, like John Searle, we can provisionally define consciousness as all the mental states that we experience. Awareness can be described as a particular focus of consciousness, like being perceptive. And human reflective consciousness can be distinguished from consciousness in general. Such distinctions are significant in a graduated account of consciousness as advocated here. And in a graduated account, initial relations can properly be described as between mind and brain, whereas more developed relations will be between consciousness and the world. And at this point we can cite some previously noted criteria or guidelines for explaining the mind-brain relation. Firstly, against deniers of consciousness, both mind and consciousness exist, as previously defined by Searle. Secondly, mind is graduated, as seen in different species and in individual growth and development. A third criterion required is a continuity of explanation without theoretical or ontological gaps. William James, for example, held that the pursuit of continuity and the elimination of disjunctions led to discoveries. Many other theorists like Gazzaniga, Richard Rorty and Max Velmans also reject discontinuities. David Chalmers calls for continuity to rule out the possibility of suddenly disappearing qualia or mental states. This is because he says such would require brute discontinuities in fundamental laws. What these fundamental laws are is uncertain, yet such continuity is certainly desirable. And the noted graduation of mind is one property that helps to make continuity possible. A fourth criterion derived from the empirical observation that minds are only ever found in living brains. The idea of ghosts or spirits lacks evidence, and AI minds would be produced by silicon brains in the future. But the precondition of needing a living brain egregiously overlooks the need for an external world. And the need for an external world is the fifth criterion or precondition of mind. So in this respect, an argument for an externalist theory of mind is called for. Externalism regards relations, events and experiences in the world as complex and as necessary as brain events. In this view, that the external world is as crucial in producing mind as the existence of a physical brain. Externalist theories have resulted from both an appreciation of at least two considerations. One is external factors in producing mind, such as external perceptions, other people, temporality, and feedback mechanisms. And that brains without worlds can't produce consciousness like brains in a vat. Another consideration is certain anomalies in explaining mind entirely in terms of the brain, such as hydrocephalus in infants destroys most of the brain without major loss of consciousness. There is also Phineas Gage's 1848 loss of a frontal lobe that left him conscious and functioning. Such facts have led to the view that there has been an overemphasis of brain neurology in explaining mind. Ted Honderich describes this as the impulse to etherealize or cranialize consciousness. Sean Gallagher further speaks of neurocentrism, and Ron Harry of a neurological fallacy. And Raymond Tallis talks about neuromania. Following this thinking, Alve No holds that we have made a category error in misunderstanding mind. That is, understanding mind in terms of brain is like understanding monetary value in terms of metallurgy. No also presents mind as a relation, process or interaction between a centre and external objects. Yet in this present study, an externalist theory of mind figures strongly in the mind-brain account to be presented. This is because externalism presents consciousness as a presence to the world or as a presence to something. That is the same kind of relation that can explain the fundamental mind-brain relation. But before getting to that point, we need to consider a sixth criterion in explaining this mind-brain relation. That is, the character of the mind or consciousness itself relative to relations with brain and the world. Theory of mind is too extensive to reproduce here, yet we can outline some relevant aspects as well as some features that hinder a resolution of the mind-brain problem. In this respect, Descartes' cogito as a thinking substance locked the mind into a dualism separated from the world. This account involves three features that must be questioned in any mind, brain, body, world relation. These are the rational or logical implications of relations with a thinking substance, the empirical or ontological implications of relations with a substance, and the problems of relations with a radically distinct and separate entity. For these and other reasons, theories of mind now seek consciousness as a process and or a relation rather than an entity. And this explains a reluctance to use the term ontology that may or may not imply substantive entities. Yet one expression of the process or relation approach is the above externalist account of mind. Another approach is phenomenology that dispelled the Cartesian dichotomy between mind and the world. Heidegger did this with Dasein as a being that is essentially in the world, and can't be separated from it. Merleau-Ponty extended this relation of being in the world with a phenomenology of the body. Heidegger emphasized the idea of process with the concept of temporality and time as the horizon of being, and Husserl spoke of the flow of consciousness and the flow of becoming, in which every experience has necessarily been preceded in time by experiences. So these and other considerations lead me to my own account of an interactionist theory of mind and a structural account of consciousness as a process or relation. And even if this view cannot be argued here, I trust that a similar reconceptualization of mind and consciousness can be conceded, as well as different kinds of relation for different kinds of subject matter. That is, the physical world is understood through an inductive a posteriori system of contingent observations. But logic and mathematics are understood through a deductive a priori system of necessary relations. And it follows that 2 plus 2 doesn't cause 4 to appear. It is necessitated by mathematical principles. But different again, consciousness presents a world of appearances with graduated and unquantifiable phenomena. And such a world requires special attention to the relations that are attributed to it, especially when those relations involve another kind of subject matter in the forms of the brain, the body, and the world. And given different kinds of phenomena with different kinds of relations, we must examine what these different kinds of relation could be. And a good place to start is at Hume's questioning of causality with constant conjunctions. In the scheme of this study, a consideration of causality and the kind of relations possible between mind and the brain is our 7th consideration after the facts of consciousness, graduation, continuity, physical brains, an external world, and the character of consciousness. Turning to Hume, he argued that physical causes aren't necessarily relations but are determined by observation. And it doesn't matter how many observations are made, they can never be complete or absolute. So the many causes that we observe are assumed or even turn out to be mistaken. In this way, scientific laws aren't immutable laws at all, but are provisional principles. And the concept of causation is thereby much more obscure than we thought it was. And John Mackey's critique of Hume nevertheless endorses the abstruse character of causality. He writes, Hume looked for psychological explanation, a very puzzling idea of a necessary connection, without having properly shown that the kind of necessity in the mind really was the key element in our concept of causation, unquote. Yet Hume's scepticism about causation opens up theory to different types of or alternatives to causation. Leibniz's metaphysics, for example, esoterically proposes 3 efficient, final, and formal kinds of causes. More plausibly, other deviations include complex causal fields, simplifications by observer selection, uncaused quantum events, and quantum entanglement beyond known causal relations in space and time. And relations between such things as atoms or neurons or even billiard balls can also interact in many ways. For example, through probability, temporality, chemically or circumstantially, that need not be described as causal. Yet for a continuous transition from matter to consciousness, David Chalmers uses the notion of information, and he also uses information both as an intermediary and as a precondition of consciousness. He notoriously claims that wherever there is causal interaction, there is information, and there is experience, and that if there is experience associated with thermostats, there is probably experience everywhere." Unquote. Searle finds Chalmers' claim about thermostats absurd and takes issue with his ambiguous use of information. That is, rain hitting the ground can convey information, but not in the sense of containing data. So Chalmers' use of information to make an unbroken transition from matter to mind is invalid. Yet we seem to be left with some sense of information that does pre-exist consciousness. In this respect, the notion of probability may help us to understand what that is. So we can next consider the concept of probability, illustrated with the idea of a coin flipped numerous times. In this experiment, the median deviation, by which heads or tails vary from 50%, will always decrease with the number of times that the coin is flipped. Now, this is a determinant of physical objects that cannot properly be called causal, yet this factor would very likely be at work in extremely complex events like those of mind-brain relations, yet working in unknown ways. This is because the material under variation might not be known. A real-life example of such probability is found in the random mutations within genetics that aren't caused by anything other than the deviations determined by probability. But of course, the genetic deviations that prove advantageous for survival cause their proliferation, and those probabilities are determined by the characteristics of the subject matter in question. That is, whether it is astrophysics, molecular structures, or genetics. Another example could be taken from chemical relations that are usually thought to be causal. That is, although many chemical reactions are well understood, some aspects still seem to be mysterious. This is the case with emerging phenomena of biological processes involving complex molecules. But more abstrusely, in chemical reactions, bonds between atoms are broken and rearranged into new substances. This happens because atoms within molecules are trying to achieve a more stable electronic configuration. And this process is driven by a fundamental impetus for stability at the atomic level. But as implied above, it's uncertain that causality can explain events at the atomic level. That is, at high levels of complexity, outcomes seem to be producible by confluences of circumstance, or organizations of constituents produce but need not cause an outcome, as in the case of probability. And in mind-brain relations, the holistic character of thought might also not be captured by sets of neural events. This deviation is expressed in such theories as Donald Davidson's anomalous monism, as well as David Wiggins' notion of cognitive underdetermination. And at the end of the spectrum, where mind becomes reflective consciousness, the possibility grows of replacing causality with reasons for action. Yet my intention above has been to extend the scope of relations beyond causality to other possibilities, and I would like to describe one such possible relation as a presence to something. This term is used by Sartre to define knowledge or cognition as a presence to something, and it is consistent with a definition of consciousness on an externalist theory of mind. It is also consistent with the widely accepted idea that consciousness is conscious of something. But Sartre rejects its use as a relation between objects, as in the neural events of pre-mind relations. Yet Sartre understandably says that the in itself, or physicality, can never by itself be a presence. Being present, in fact, is an ecstatic mode of being of the for itself or consciousness, unquote. Yet for the more speculative material relation, we can refer to both Samuel Alexander and A.N. Whitehead. Alexander's allusion to presence referred to knowledge as compresence of a mind with an object. This was a metaphysical or even a mystical idea that it can only serve as an illustrative metaphor. But we are trying to formulate a plausible concept which can describe both the relations between material objects and the relations between material objects and mental states in the same way. This would be the kind of relation that will bridge the mind-brain-body divide. The hypothesis here is that the notion of presence to something is a relation that can describe all physical, material and neurological interactions, all the way to and including the relations of consciousness with the world. Yet it remains to be seen whether this relation of presence to something can be substantiated. That is, even though it would be able to draw on features outlined above, like probability and circumstance. Whitehead gives us slightly more respectable concepts than Alexander in the forms of prehension and uncognitive apprehension. But I'm uncertain whether Whitehead's unorthodox theories can be adopted or should be dismissed as speculation. In his view, every experience is constituted by relations to past events and a continuous flow throughout the universe. Whitehead's rejection of the scientific materialism and its indiscriminate application of causality, together with his process philosophy and relational connectedness of reality, should be relevant to the mind-brain relation as presented here. His key concepts of prehension or uncognitive apprehension also define such relations through time and space. The term uncognitive further shows that these relations are not always knowledge-based, and that our connection to the world begins with a pre-epistemic prehension of it. That is, he went beyond an interactionist view to propose internal relations within matter. Also, due to his panpsychism, mental objects and physical objects relate internally and to each other in the same way. This means that, on this account, mental and physical relations could be described as of the same kind, and a prima facie view of that relation seemed to compare with the noted presence to something. But it does help to understand that Whitehead held to panpsychism, which finds consciousness in everything. This enabled him to relate mental objects in the same way that physical objects relate to each other. Yet key themes in his work are structure and process, as well as relation, and are compatible here. But Whitehead's metaphysics and his panpsychism rule out his thinking as a philosophical foundation. That is, unless we can find some other way of retaining his basic conceptual framework. One way is to replace Whitehead's metaphysics with quantum science and other kinds of relations noted earlier. This fits because Whitehead wrote Science and the Modern World 10 years before Einstein proposed quantum entanglement. Also with Whitehead, we can start explanations at the beginning of things with matter, rather than as partial explanations that start with something like life or neurology. But these explanations of mind-brain relations may be missing the point of the idea of presence to something. That is, these metaphysical, quantum, chemical, probabilistic and informational relations may be contingent, and the idea that presence must relate to things in one specific way is an assumption. I'm reluctant to quote Colin McGinn on this, but he says that there are intuitions pressed from Descartes to Kripke to the effect that the relation between consciousness states and bodily states is fundamentally contingent, and it may be that we do not and cannot grasp the nature of the property that intelligibly links them." Unquote. The question is, though, what is contingent and what is not? And in my view, the relation of presence to something is not contingent. But like any other kind of presence, that presence need not signify itself in any particular way. I can, for example, signify my presence by waving my hand, just sitting here, or shouting. These differences don't alter the fact of my presence. The fact is that physical objects relate to each other in very different ways, some of which we have outlined. And I can't rule out the possibility of AI minds with silicon brains in addition to neurologically based minds. And in the case of mind-brain relations, the presence of objects to other objects and the presence of objects to mind is different and changes as the relation develops from, for example, neurological or chemical to unconscious events, or the relation of reflective consciousness to the world or itself. That is, the defining fact is the presence to something, not its manner of instantiation or presentation. And the crucial understanding of that fact is derived from how the situation is interpreted. Like human action can be interpreted as religious, moral, or psychological. Yet that interpretation is crucial to understanding the fact of the matter. This interpretation of mind-brain relations in terms of presence to something is certainly new. The unanswered question is whether this account is valid. Yet another way of proving an idea, apart from theory, is to see how it works in practice, answering our questions. And like Whitehead, I wanted to start an explanation at the beginning with matter before life. And we can then consider how simple relation can undergo significant developments. We noted, for example, that atoms, neurons, or billiard balls interact in many ways, like gravitationally or causally. But these are simple relations which don't produce even infinitely low levels of consciousness. But some events are also complex, contained systems, have structure, feedback, and qualify as interactions. For example, engines, machines, computers with cause and effect in repetitious and continuous processes. And complexity increases with feedback loops, even in machines like internal combustion engines. Complexity increases in systems like quantum computers, plants, and single-cell creatures like amoebas. These entities are integrated systems with complex interactions that register objects. These interactions and registrations may mimic but don't amount to recognition or cognition. Yet further complexity is found in insects, animals, apes, and humans with increasing consciousness. But I argued earlier that complexity, or even organisation, and certain constituents are not sufficient. The crucial factor isn't complexity, or even the organisation of that complexity. The crucial factor is relations of engagement, registration, and presence to something. These relations simulate intentionality towards objects that consciousness is conscious of something. This provides a continuity of explanation from all causal interactions to consciousness. And these kinds of relation can be described with the same principle that are described in the following way: as a presence to something, registering of something, attending to something, as apprehending something, or as influencing something. And we consider these properties as part of a process of continuous development. Causal and other object-to-object relations develop into complex chemical relations. Complex chemical relations develop into simple life forms like bacteria and amoeba. and amoeba register the world as single organisms with feedback mechanisms. Next is, in this development, consider insects with perceptions of objects in the world in which they move. Insects see something, have a form of cognition of the world, yet they may not be conscious. We can lastly consider simple animals like mice, which are conscious, have cognition, and are also sentient. Humans are conscious, with perceptions complex enough to recognize their own existence. The process of this development can be described as one of interaction, registration, consciousness, and finally reflective self-consciousness. The hypothesis here is that it's not complexity or its organization that is key to producing consciousness. What is key is the relation of presence to something in increasingly sophisticated kinds of registration. Yet other factors remain among the many preconditions required to produce consciousness. The key here is that the fundamental relation between objects and consciousness is the same. That is, the relation between objects has the same structure as the relation that produces consciousness. That is, as a presence to something, registering of something, or apprehending something. In conclusion, the mind-brain problem is a problem that is resolved by understanding how the mind-brain relations have the same relations that consciousness has with the world in the form of a presence to something. That conclusion was reached by following certain criteria or guidelines, such as an externalist theory of mind, graduation, and a continuity of explanation for material relations to those of consciousness. Graduation and continuity provided a seamless account of the development of mind from matter. And binary perspectives in which zero levels of mind become instances of mind are invalidated by that continuous and seamless account of development. That is like the invalidity of defining lines between different colours. Yet possible kinds of relation also went beyond causality to information, probability, chemistry, circumstance, and quantum events. But it was proposed that these different kinds of relation are different ways of instantiating the fact of presence to something that answered the mind-brain question. This was made possible on a new understanding of that relation based on the foregoing concepts and ideas. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com. The kind of response that I'm looking for is either approbation of the contribution made or an explanation of where I have gone wrong.